and welcome to this evening's Five Leaves event, Old Mistresses, with Griselda Pollock. Griselda Pollock is a professor of social and critical histories at the University of Leeds. Her book, co-authored with the late Rozika Parker, Old Mistresses, Women, Art and Ideology, was first published in 1981 and was republished last month as part of the Bloomsbury Revelations series. It has been described as a classic work on feminist art history by the judges of the prestigious Holberg Prize, who this year awarded the prize to her, the first time an art historian has ever won it. Old Mistresses offers a critique of the way the discipline of art history has created and protected its myths of the great white man artist, has valued oil painting over craft and textiles, and has failed to understand what the creative work of women contributes to our understanding of ourselves and our world, and also made a heap of trouble for contemporary women artists, especially those who choose to be mothers and artists. Its insights are as relevant today as 50 years ago, when it was daringly conceived in a feminist collective. Many people think such a book might be just about recovering forgotten names of women artists. Its purpose, however, was to explain how women were written out of art history and continue to be so. Old Mistresses is available at a discount for £17.50 from the Five Leaves bookstore if you visit their website. Do buy this book. It really does kick the chair from under so much of 20th century and contemporary art history. Griselda has prepared a 25-minute introduction to the book, after which she will take questions. So if there are any that you would like to ask her, do put them in the Q&A, the question and answer box, not the chat box on your Zoom screen. So it's a great privilege to be able to introduce Griselda Pollock to you and to add her name to the list of eminent authors and academics who have taken part in online Five Leaves events this year. So over to you, Griselda.
Good evening. I'm delighted to be with you this evening, and I thank Five Leaves for inviting me to talk with you this evening about Old Mistresses, and thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm sitting in front of a painting which shows a younger version of myself and a younger version of Rozika Parker, just to remind you that although I'm doing this introduction alone, the book was written by two women in a feminist collaboration, and we must mourn the loss of Rozika Parker, but remind us that she was as much the intellectual force as I was in the making of this work. I'm now going to share my screen and present a little talk with some images. So what's in the book? Why should you even think about being here to think about buying it? Well, it offers a feminist analysis of art and art's histories. And the question is, what is that? Well, the book was written in a period when lots of books were written, forming the emergence of feminist art history, in which we rediscovered loads and loads of women artists, and in which some of the authors that you can see here were trying to explain the social conditions of the difficulties that women had experienced in the past: access to training, conventional attitudes that women shouldn't earn money by being professionals. And they generally agreed that there had not been any great women artists. There had been some exceptions, as Germaine Greer put it. But the books proved how easy it was to locate the names, the works, the earlier documentation, all the apparatus of a significant artistic career, right up until these massive dictionaries of world artists at the beginning of the 20th century. So how could we have such evidence and yet be told nothing about them? So when we came to write Old Mistresses, or the book we were writing before we called it, Rosie and I were completely convinced that we had to answer the question, did we need another book like this? And we did not offer a survey. We were going to argue that, and what we discovered was structural and systemic sexism in art history itself. So I'm going to go through the chapters just to give you an idea of what makes it a particular kind of book. I have to move that away. So the first chapter is called How Essential is Femininity, which is a kind of pun on the notion that femininity is the essence of womanhood. And because it is the essence, it's the essence of the reason that women are inadequate as artists, have no great originality, are derivative, decorative, sentimental, weak in every way. But at the same time, what we proved was that the concept of femininity, this stereotype, this negative stereotype, was essential to the construction of a discourse that is art history, because what art history produces, doesn't just document, it produces the idea of the great white man artist. Yet that history, that ideal, is interrupted by the existence of women's artistic interventions in art, which have to be negated constantly as not as good as weaker than. And at the same time, we discovered it wasn't that women suffered simply various kinds of discrimination and difficulty. They overcame most of that consistently, and they negotiated their conditions of difference. They made what they made as much because of those different conditions as despite the limitations that were imposed upon them. We then looked at the hierarchy in the art world, which is important, a hierarchy between arts and crafts, in which we gender the value of materials, paint over needles, oil paint, canvas over cloth. And these are also a way of giving a hierarchy of Western art, which uses paint and oil and canvas and and sculpture and marble, over the rest of the world, which predominantly often works with different kinds of work, and particularly cloth and fabric and needlework. Then we had to analyze the typologies of representation of the feminine, which developed a process in which woman came to be identified in various ways, an object of art, an object of fantasy, that which is represented. And there are limitations and typologies which do not include representing women as creative intellectuals. So then we had to look at the ways in which women artists had to self-inscribe and self-portray themselves to represent the creative subject as a woman. And finally, we had to ask, what was the legacy of art history's negation of women, negation of femininity as this stereotype of otherness that supports the great male artist, this hierarchy of values and this typology of representation and the struggle women had to inscribe themselves. What did that mean for contemporary women artists? And where was feminism in relation to a critique of that, both in art and in identity and in art history? And how did we, Rosie and I, as art historians, have to ensure a backstory, a better backstory for the contemporary artists whom we feared would be disappeared, as had indeed we had seen the women from the past. So then when we came to write the book, we had to think about the cover. This is going to present a kind of statement to the world, how to counter racism and sexism, we felt, but no one noticed this. So here's the original cover from the 1979, when we designed it, in 81 when it was finally published. There's a story that goes along with that, but not now, etc. And what we chose to put on it was a work by the artist Marisol Escobar, who was from Venezuela. And sorry, I've spelt Venezuela incorrectly there, apologies to Venezuela, who died only very recently. And this work was called White Dreams, interestingly in the collection of an artist called Joan Mondale, who supported women artists through the 20th century, and she was known as Joan of Art. White Dreams shows a Latin American woman with a brown mask, using brown clay, which was a commentary on the way in which she was treated as if she were a brown woman, a black woman, a woman of color, when she came to work in New York. And she shows you this, her kind of cast of her face with a white carnation drooping, a kind of reference also to the exoticization of women associated with Spanish, a kind of Carmen-like figure, the femme fatale. So there's a lot of meaning in this cover, which of course was to us a very important thing, to put a woman of color on the cover, a woman from Latin America, and a woman making a critique of a double issue of sexism and racism. But this would not go in America. So the American publisher said nobody in America will understand that, even though she was an artist working in America. So they chose to have a work by one of their own, Alice Barber Stevens, a 19th century artist, and then they put on the cover an image of a women's studio. This means the women artists are represented here as nice Victorian ladies, all as students. And then at the center of the painting is the very thing we were critiquing, which is the representation of woman as the body in art, not the creative subject of art. We had to choose other covers as the reprints have gone through. It's had a very long life, this book. So in 1992, we chose Merritt Oppenheim, a surrealist from the 1930s, whose work is one of the most important, the Fur Teacup of the surrealist objects, a remarkable work, which is one of the very few by women that was ever shown in the Museum of Modern Art. And then when it came to the 2013, we had witnessed the, let me see if I can move this away. We could witnessed the fall of the Berlin Wall and the rediscovery of a whole series of artists who, in Eastern Europe, and women artists in Eastern Europe, who had become invisible to us because of the Cold War. So in solidarity with the expanded, the kind of ex-Soviet countries of the 20th century, I chose a work by a Polish artist, Anna Bielinska-Bogdanowicz, to put on the cover. So when we came to do the 2020, I chose to put this image on it, which is a drawing in the British Museum, the hand of Artemisia Gentileschi, drawn by Pierre de Moustier II in 1625, as a mark of a sense of her enormous fame by the mid-1620s and her international repute as she traveled across Europe from Venice to Naples, to Genoa, to Rome and to Florence, and ultimately to England. And it is in England where, in France, that she was painted by Simone Vouet, also showing her hand, the actual instrument of painting, as well as the sort of intelligence of her face. And then in the 1630s, or possibly earlier, she painted an allegory of painting, not a self-portrait, but an allegory of painting using the very specific iconography for this La Pittura, this allegory of art, which involves a woman with disheveled hair, with a beautiful shining dress, a palette, and a chain around her neck with imitatio, imitation, on the medallion. And if you notice the different hands here between the sort of delicacy of a woman almost holding a paintbrush as if it's a decoration, and the kind of workmanlike or workwoman-like way she holds it in the image of La Pittura. But this picture was considered anonymous and unknown until 1963, when it was finally cleaned and they discovered the signature along the bottom. And of course, then we have this massive issue of the ways in which women have presented and figured themselves as artists at work, as calling to the rest of the world to identify this, including along the bottom. I here want to introduce, there are many queer women artists here. There is Amrita Sher Gill, the Indian artist born between Hungary and India. The Claudette Johnson, who recently had a show at the Museum of Modern Art. There was a Chinese women's art community in Paris. This is Pan Yu Liang. And of course, the way in which Black artists in Britain have had to inscribe themselves as thinkers and actors. Here is Lubaina Himid with her partner, Maud Salter. And I want to focus a little bit on Lubaina Himid because her story is one that is so critical. which is introducing the additional dimensions of sexism and racism as they entangle with each other. Lubaina's installation here in 1986 called A Fashionable Marriage. This is my appallingly poor slide that has survived as a photograph, showing the space in which she exhibited this, which was the gallery she herself had created, the Elbow Room. It waited until 2014 to come to the Tate Liverpool, but I must just show you that it's obviously a reference to an 18th century painting, Hogarth's Marriage à la Mode, which includes a servant serving coffee and a child playing with the lute that this group has brought from Africa. But it went to, first in 2014 in the Tate, 2017 it was shown again at the Nottingham Contemporary, which was one of the exhibitions on the basis of which she was nominated and ultimately won the Turner Prize, and here it is in Hull. And I want to draw your attention to one particular figure in it, this 9-foot figure of the woman of color, the Black woman artist, offering to share her energy and force with the white women who, even though they were struggling as white feminists, still had more visibility than she or Maud Salter or Claudette Johnson or Sonia Boyce or Ingrid Pollard or any of the group that they were working with. And so she's referring obviously to the dinner party, to Mary Kelly's Interim, and to Susan Hiller's Midnight in this figure. I always feel that this also references the white feminist art historian. She denies that it's anything to do with me. What's in a title? This is the next thing I want to talk about. Language and power, language and hierarchy. This is the key thing that Old Mistresses tries to say. We must analyze the language, which is why I refuse to talk about women artists. I want to talk about artist men, artist women, not because the word artist, if left on its own, is by default heard as white, straight, and masculine. And we have to say a Black artist or a woman artist or a queer artist. Now, 1972, we were completely transformed by an exhibition called Old Mistresses, Women Artists of the Past, curated by Elizabeth Brown and Anne Gabhart, to whom we owe everything. They first went around the world and collected, around America, and discovered all these women in the basements, but they make the point here that the exhibition alludes to the unspoken assumption in our language that art is created by men. The reverential term old master has no meaningful equivalent. When cast in its feminine form, old mistress, the connotation is altogether different, to say the least. So this was such a bombshell of an understanding of how language is already encoding this hierarchy of gender. But the exhibition were revelations. We suddenly saw works like these gorgeous works by Sophonisba Anguissola, by Clarissa, by Hildegard von Bingen, by Elizabeth Serrani, by Artemisia Gentileschi, Fede Galizia, Sibylla Marianne, Charlotte Charpentier, and Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun. And we had slides. They had a slide pack, which was the only images we had to continue going around to our schools and our art colleges and lecturing to say to all the women artists we saw there, or the artist women, there they were. So Rosie Parker reported this exhibition in Spare Rib in 1973, and it impacted on us as nascent feminist art historians. Here we are again. And it led me to go and ask what was going on in the National Gallery. So this was my first publication in feminist publication. So I went to the National Gallery in the spirit of Carrie Mae Weems, who was much later in the 2000s, as it were, this century, gone and stood as a Black woman, a woman of color, in front of the great museums of the world, asking them, there's the British Museum, am I in your collection? Are people like me in your collection? Have you actually documented and collected our creativity? In the National Gallery, I found 9 works from the 16th century right the way to the 19th century. Rosie loved cats, so I just wanted to pick up this rather beautiful cat for you. Cats were a kind of joke always between us and her. And here is one other work by Rosa Bonheur, which is in the museum, but is never shown because it's actually a copy jointly made by Rosa Bonheur and her life partner Natalie Mikas, which apparently has diminished its value because it's not by one person, but by two. Bev Morisot's Summertime is usually shown, it alternates between Dublin and London because it's part of a disputed things. And then there was one woman of color represented, was attributed to this artist, this 18th century French artist, Marie-Guillaume Medois, because she was the only other woman artist that they knew of who had painted a woman of color. I think they're very different, and this is now simply an anonymous painting. And I wanted to bring attention to Rosa Bonheur and Natalie Mikas, a long-term queer partnership. They were both artists, and the portrait of Rosa Bonheur is created by Anna Klumke, another professional artist and part of the queer community that was part of the suffrage movement in the United States. So where are we now in the National Gallery? They have acquired, finally, in 2016, I think it was, this work by Artemisia Gentileschi of the Martyr St. Catherine. It took them from 1824 to the date which they bought it. Let me get this right. This is only the 20th work by an artist woman acquired in 196 years of the National Gallery, and the huge feminist research that had gone on for 50 years. So that means that for 50 years, curators or directors have not changed what the public sees and what we learn about ourselves as women and men in our histories. So apart from those 9 that I saw in 1972-73, we've managed to collect another sort of 16 works, and that is in the totality of the National Gallery as it represents the history of art to us and teaches you. So the issues are not missing or forgotten women artists, but this systemic sexism and racism in academic and museum art history, and now by the dealers in the art market. So if we look in 1989, when the Guerrilla Girls made this poster, sorry, I have to go back now. I'm just going to move this. The price paid for one Jasper Johns would buy you a work by every single one of these artists. This profoundly shocking sense of how the lack of symbolic value given to women artists by art history, and this constant use of the feminine stereotype of their being lesser, turns into real poverty, real discouragement, real invisibility, real loss of our understanding that men and women have co-created art throughout history. And in 2019, women artists form 2% of the current art sales in an art market worth $196 billion. And of that 2%, 40% of the value, the money spent, is split between just 5 women artists who have been selected out of this mass to be, as it were, the celebrity representatives of women. All of them are white, all of them are dead, except Yo-Yo Kusama. And if you want to look that up, there is the reference. Just Google ArtNet and women on the art market. So where are we now? Do we still need this kind of book when we've got celebrity women artists and that the stars of movies and even TV series? We've got a show at the National Gallery, but notice Artemisia, not Artemisia Gentileschi. We don't have shows called Pablo, Marcel, Henri, Gerhardt, Jackson, but the tendency to speak about women artists in their first names only is part of the structural sexism that you don't even notice you're doing. Women students do it all the time, spontaneously. People talk about Eva and Frida. They don't say Carlo and Hess. And then we have a newly discovered female old master. Again, femaling the woman, not the newly discovered work of a great 17th century Baroque painter, possibly one of the greatest. No, she has to be in the subcategory, female old master. And then, can't wait, Artemisia on Netflix, a TV series, is about to go on into production. It's going to be produced by Frida Torres Blanco, based on biographical studies, based on the biographies. And I cannot bear another story that makes me weep at seeing her fingers crushed, or stories of her teenage rape without any understanding of the feminist literature on the implications of sexual violation and its long-term effect. It's simply sensationalized in order for them then to read the work through it. Now, what we tried to do in our book was to read images for the creative difference of women, not from their being different from men and therefore lesser. And we offered analysis, not biographical reductionism or false celebrity. So I just want to give you one example of that, which is by, go back again. I want to acknowledge Nanette Solomon, who is the art historian who drew this to my attention. And I think it's such a brilliant comparison, it's worth sharing, which is, here's Artemisia Gentileschi, Artemisia Gentileschi's teacher and father, who trained her. And when we look at two images of the Madonna and child, the basic iconography is there of the lactating Madonna and the child. But the little boy of Orazio is rigid with anxiety. His little fist is clenched, his toes are lifted, his whole body is rigid with the excitement and the gaze of his mother as he has the orality of the nipple going into his mouth. In the case of the painting on the left, it was attributed to Orazio, then reattributed to Artemisia Gentileschi on the basis that it's a more gentle painting and it's more typical of a feminine artist. But I want you to look at the extraordinariness of the gesture. This is a psychologically different painting in which the child, alertly and much older, with no specific sex revealed, reaches up to touch the face of the mother. This is a gesture from the child to the mother, this exploring the space, exploring otherness, reaching to touch. And yet the face is either ecstatic, the mother is closed eyes, is that in ecstasy? Or I have a sense that it's the image of a dead mother, the mother who isn't there and the child is reaching to touch it. So there is a possibility of psychological interpretations in relation not to the violation of Artemisia Gentileschi, but the most central fact of her loss of her mother. And indeed, she was a mother who lost herself, 3 children. So thanks to Nanette Solomon. And as we go through these great works, which are always treated as if these paintings of this subject, Judith and Holofernes, is a revenge painting. It's a painting in which she took it out on the men by cutting off, enjoying the production of paintings by Judith of Holofernes. But we look at these two pictures, we're looking at different types of composition. We're not looking at differences between men and women, but a conceptualization that doesn't make the women a kind of decorative pair, as we see in Orazio Gentileschi, but has used the language of Caravaggio to compress the space, to make us feel that we're actually there. We're almost listening with these women in agony as they hear a soldier go by. This is one of the key points in the story. Could they escape? And when we come to the famous images of the execution of Holofernes, I want to suggest that these images are in fact images that are the staging of Artemisia Gentileschi's declaration of independence. I have to put this one down here. From Caravaggio, who was her inspiration as one of the hottest and most interesting painters at the time, and from her father. Because the story is not a revenge story. This is not an iconography of revenge. It's a political allegory which could be used as a declaration of independence. And that's what I argue in the follow-up to Old Mistresses, which is called Difference in the Canon, that I wrote, as you can see, 20 years later, to ask myself the question, why was the canon still in place despite all that we had demonstrated? And this is why Old Mistresses is still relevant now. We know more names. Some artist women have been adopted. The vast majority of artists who are women remain poorer, less valued, less seen by the public. And art history has permitted a feminist margin in the discipline, but it has not built on the critique we pose to the discipline. And now that critique is extended to decolonization. But how will women of color fare in that project? Will decolonization incorporate the entire frame of the feminist critique that, in our strange way as 2 graduate students trying to take on the patriarchy with a lot of dairy milk chocolate to help us, Rosie and I try to offer and still offer in this book? Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Griselda. That was absolutely fascinating. I was sitting on the edge of my seat, as I'm sure others were too. And although there are some questions, I also was wondering, really leading off from what you were saying at the end, I was wondering to what extent art history has changed since you wrote the book.
Well, thank you for asking me. And I think I am trying to not be too dispiriting, but kind of realistic, because we are both seeing that there has been an expansion and there are people writing their PhDs and all the rest of it. But no one is teaching systematically the complexity of feminist analysis. There will be courses on women artists or specialisms that are folded into other things. And I know there are some wonderful scholars of all generations out there doing their very best. But my argument is that it's not sufficient to be allowed to do it. So even in my university, people say, I don't need to do gender, Griselda does it. And when I finally retire, which is very shortly, there's no provision for somebody to say, this is such a major area of 20th century thought that needs cultural theory. It needs a way of rethinking what you do when you do art history. It needs a grand knowledge, this whole archive of women of the 20th century. And so I have little steps forward, but I'm always contesting with this sense that this is politically argued or overinvested, rather than it's a fundamental question that everybody has to change. So as far as I'm concerned, I am called upon by the obligation of my queer students, my students of color, my students with disabilities, my students from different parts of the world, that when I give lectures, they must also be in those lectures, right? They must find themselves not just simply getting a story, you know, of you know, women who look like me.
Yeah.
And that's an obligation. This is not a politics, because so many of my students, going back to Schutter Biswas in 1984, said to me, this feminism is fine, but I need to be nourished in my own terms, right? Will you do something about it? And of course I could say, oh, I'm sorry, I'm not trained, I don't know that. Or I'm trained to find out.
Yeah.
So I have to do this. I have to keep asking myself, what will be the effect of this talk, this lecture? Will it, as it were, continue to maintain a certain structure, or will it have shifted that? And what I find is I'm delighted. I know that my work is written for women and to encourage women and to sustain them intellectually, and with the sort of profound pride in all this work that women have done. But I don't think the vast majority of art history listens. They allow us to be feminists. But they don't say, you know, they have to read it. They don't read my work in the way that I read everybody else's, as well as my own and other feminists.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
That's why I keep pressing. This is a structural issue, which now the decolonization movement has made more public, right? But we are going to lose the specificity of the feminist thing, because it'll be folded back into race, class, gender, sexuality. But this is much more central in certain ways, because it's so much part of every category is structured by gender. Gender slashes its way through race, through class, through sexuality, through ability.
Thank you. No, I agree. We've got a question that leads off rather neatly from mine, actually, from A. Spinks, who asks, what, if anything, has changed when it comes to the hierarchy of the arts and crafts since you first published the book? It's been 20 years since I studied textiles at Goldsmiths, and we studied your texts at the time, and the ideas still inform my work now. So that's nice. So
that's lovely. And no doubt you also read Rozika Parker's amazing and transformative book, Subversive Stitch, which has been the kind of foundations for so much work. I think there's been a lot of work on that. There's a wonderful journal called Textiles that Janice Jeffries and Panina Barnett, who was at Leeds and one of the first fine art students I taught, who kind of was sort of suffering from the kind of way that she was put down. I think it's also enlarged to be enabled to understand that textiles are not kind of crafts for minor people, or third world people, that this is one of the great art forms of the world. So I think you still continue to struggle with this hierarchy, but there's been quite a lot of work in museums about this. I mean, it's an easier thing to shift. And of course, once the sort of the great aristocrats, painting and sculpture, were shattered by performance and installation work and video work, there's a kind of much wider variety of materials that are being used. But this is something I still think that we need to work, but it's not quite as hierarchical in the way that I think it was in the 1970s. But I'm sure you're still finding this association between women and textiles. And so we'll have what's the name? Abakanova, the Polish artist, but then that's a huge textile. So that's a nice, massive. But if you do delicate things, I suspect you're still, that's a hidden element of it.
Thank you. We've got a question from Amy McTurk, which I think might interest a lot of people. She says, I completely agree with your critique of the focus on Artemisia Gentileschi's biography. I was wondering to what extent you think biography should be either disregarded or included when considering the work of artists who are women, especially when it seems like the biography of men artists often became a major part of their artist's myth. Van Gogh is the example that immediately springs to mind for me.
Thank you, Amy, for that brilliant and wonderful question. I think it's a very simple one. There is something called biographical reductionism. What happens with women artists is their work is reduced to their biography as if they bleed into art, you know, as if they literally can't but just be in art. Whereas, of course, art has to come from lived experience. Artists speak in the first person. That's what we want them to do. If they speak in a collective voice, we say they're being a bit too political. Art is a space where someone can speak from their lived experience, but therefore the notion of the life of a man and the notion of the life of a woman is different. Women seem to have no distance from life, whereas men transform life into art. So you're absolutely right. The myth of the great artist is built since Vasari on the notion that there is an artist's biography, and that has a typology. You have to be brilliant in childhood, not pay attention at school, be scribbling in your notebook all the time. Then an older artist notices you. Then you are a complete sort of prodigy and everybody thinks you're a genius, etc. And then you go on to be absolutely great and become Il Divino like Michelangelo. There's another level, which is that you'll suffer. Okay, so even from the Middle Ages of the early, you know, the melancholia of artists in the sort of the Renaissance period, you're allowed to be a suffering artist, right? But the nature of the lives of women is not part of our culture anyway, because we're all typed. You know, you're a girl, you're a teen, you know, an adolescent, you're a virgin, you're a wife, you're a mother, you're a lesbian, you're a whore, you're an old hag. Right, that's the typology we've got. So there's not a sense in which we have a history of the complexity of human biography. And that's what I mean about, you know, I don't ignore the conditions of Artemisia's life, but feminism would come in Artemisia Gentileschi, I did it myself, Artemisia Gentileschi's life. I would come in on these two levels, which is I'm asking not what is specific to her biography that is expressed in her art, but what are the conditions of living, psychological, subjective, terms of life as a woman in Roman Catholic, you know, Counter-Reformation, Baroque Italy, that might be inscribed into the work by means of artistic construction. So that's why I was interested in this touch, this question of when her eyes are open or eyes closed, which she uses quite often. And this sense that I bring to art, I bring my life to it, I lend some of it, that I'm interested in child loss, I'm interested in maternal bereavement. And that is like sensitizes me to certain tenors in certain works. So again, with Eva Hesse, I think the question of what it is to lose your mother when you're a teenager is a real psychological event in your life, not just a biographical fact. And it's not just expressed because you don't even know what the effect of this is, but we can read the artwork for traces that indicate something about the subjective psychological complexity of the ways women experience the grained issues of desire, loss, physical disease, aging, the sort of set of trauma in sense of having a child and all these other things. So I'm not excluding the biographical. And when it comes to Van Gogh, one of my PhD is on kind of giving a different account of an amateur self-taught artist who was a great reader of Victorian literature, who positioned himself, you know, on the edges of the modernism he didn't understand. And that's interesting. And he's a Protestant, and it matters he's a Protestant, and it matters that Gauguin was a devout Catholic. These are important factors that art historians have to take into account, but not as a reduction of women who could only simply be their biographies in art, and which means they're not being treated as transforming experience through artistic languages. So thank you for that really great question.
Yeah, thank you. One more question, which I think will be of general interest, from Ronnie Randall. How much do we know about how women artists are viewed in other cultures, from Africa, Asia, the Middle East? Is there a similar hierarchy to that in Western art?
That's a great question too. You may find me more ignorant than I would like to be about all of these things, because it's an enormous amount of world art to know about. And what I'm not going to claim to be an expert in this. I think what we find, of course, is that what we are dealing with in the European language world is the creation of art history as a formal discipline in a university that emerges at the foundation of the nation states of modern Europe. And art history is founded to create an image of the culture of each nation. So Germany is the Lutheran spirit, you know, France is a Catholic country, Italy has the Renaissance and Rome. Of course, poor old England doesn't have anything much to, except they borrow from everybody else, etc. But, you know, that art was founded to tell that story. So that's these national schools and then these periods of Western history. Now, the art history that's happening in other cultures and other societies have a different format. So there's some very interesting work on the history of aesthetics and the traditions, as it were, the periodization of the history of aesthetics and artistic practice, for instance, in India, which is a very, very ancient tradition of aesthetics, which is then going to intersect with you know, the rise of sort of Hindu cultures, the arrival of the Mughal, you know, Islamic cultures, the impact of Buddhism, and all of those. And those are on a very different timescale. So the history of, let's say, the sort of authorization of history of Chinese art is associated with court culture and intellectuals, because artists were always intellectuals, because it's a kind of a writing and knowing and thinking, which is very different from cultures where art is commissioned, or you don't have an artist yet, you have crafts people of a certain kind, or you have court people. So within that context, I think there are issues, or histories of the way women were involved in, for instance, Chinese court women painted in different sorts of ways. I can't think into the same extent, but of course in Africa, we're talking about very different cultures and constructions, which relate to religious organizations. But as Lubena Hamid has done an enormous amount of work, which is to do with the culture of textiles and how women made and used textiles as a language in a different way, I think, from who were designated the carvers in some of the West African cultures. So it's the concept of the artist and the role of art in that society and the designation of who does it, which will be varied. And the concept of a woman artist is radically different from what we have in the West, when you construct the notion from Vasari onwards of this central creative genius. But I think feminists across the world are working on this, and it's much of the great struggle. I'm just about to publish a book about, in my series, not I've written it, but Jiyoung Shin has written it, on the history of Korea. And in one of the books we wrote, Generations and Geographies, there are essays by Zumi Nagasaki from China, and Jungpaek Park Chun, looking at the development of women in modernism in modernizing Asian countries. There's a big project on gender in Asia through Pauline Yao at M+, which is the big museum in Hong Kong that's been built, exploring this historically, but largely in the contemporary. So I think it is still an issue, and Yayoi Kusama was clearly running away from an incredible patriarchy in Japanese modernism. But then we have Atsuko, I've forgotten her surname, Atsuko, the wonderful Gutai artist who did the electric dress. We find women are wherever they can be, you will find them.
Thank you. That's a really interesting answer. Now, the questions are piling in, but the time is running out, I'm afraid. So I'm going to just read one more question, and I'm afraid we'll have to end with this one. So I'm sorry to everybody else who hasn't been able to get answers to their questions. This is a question which I'm going to slightly paraphrase from Harriet Olson, who has founded Eiderdown Books a couple of years ago in order to get more books about women artists onto the bookshelves. And she wants to ask you about art books published about women artists. And she says, in 2012, Judy Chicago wrote an opinion piece in The Guardian in which she said that while she was making her work The Dinner Party, only 0.5% of art books published were about women, though she said more recently that that had risen to about 2.7%. So Harriet Olson is wondering what you think about how well publishing has managed to tell the story about women artists so far.
Appallingly. I mean, as somebody who's collected every possible book that I could, in the historical terms, we're very slowly, getting the books. It depends on dedicated feminist art historians who put their reputations on the line by choosing to do a PhD or write a catalogue raisonné to do the fundamental work that establishes it. So I acknowledge Mary Garrard for the fantastic, incredible work on Renaissance women artists that she's dedicated herself to. And we've now got, 2 books on Sofonisba Anguissola. We've got, I think we've got one big catalogue exhibition of Judith Leister. I mean, it's pathetic. And I'll just give you one example. Mary Cassatt. This is very close to my heart because I was very passionate about that. I wrote about her. And my book, which was, I think, along with Whitney Chadwick's Thames and Hudson sort of Women in the History of Art sort of general survey that came out in 1991, my book on Mary Cassatt was, I think, one of the very first in the Thames and Hudson World of Art series on a woman. It went out of print very quickly. It's out of print now. They decided not to carry on with it. And that is because there are no Mary Cassatts in Britain, apart from one in Glasgow and one in Scotland. And even when they do exhibitions, like they did at the National Gallery of Durand-Ruel and the Impressionists and the Dealer, even though Mary Cassatt had sustained that dealer financially and had been part and parcel of the first egalitarian art movement in the history of the world, Impressionism was, the Society of Exhibitors was egalitarian and had 4 or 5 women in it. Mary Cassatt was not present. They had one Morisot or 2, and then Mary Cassatt was just somewhere down the line in the 1890s, not there in the 1870s. And of course, this means that people come to the museum, they do not see women work, and they say, oh my God, look, this amazing artist, and then go to the bookshop and say, I must buy a book. So because they don't see it and they are not shown, they don't want a book, and then the publishers don't want to publish things. I mean, I have just published, and I'm sorry to promote my own book, but this book on Charlotte Salomon, who was a German Jewish artist who was murdered when she was 26 and left this extraordinary work of art. Now, this is the first art historical study of her on a grand scale. There's Astrid Schmetterling, who did some very, very important work writing in German. And there's been some wonderful there's been a thesis and some articles, etc. But this book required a lot of subvention to be able to print it, to be able to, because they would not anticipate the sales that would cover the cost of doing it in color. Mm. So the economics of publication is very difficult, and it has real effects, because if the books aren't there, people just don't find out about these artists and do that. So I think it is a kind of a problem. And because not enough of us teach feminist art history, women who want to get on in art history won't touch it, because then you'll be called a feminist art history. Nobody's going to advertise a post for a feminist art historian. You get your post in by being authorized as a safe thing. Do your thesis on Marcel Duchamp and you'll be fine. Then you can go crazy and talk about, you know, the Baroness from Frelinghausen, who was actually the originator of the ready-mades. But I do find that that is a considerable issue, and I grant you that. And this is why I think keeping pressing this issue forward and encouraging young students to understand that this is necessary, because it's not just special pleading, it's deforming our imaginations generation after generation and disinforming the public who don't see themselves. And you think of all those little children who go to museums with their schools and do not find themselves seeing themselves in images. So I think not only do we have to write books, but we have to buy works by women artists, so where you can possibly do that. And often they're very glad of even small amounts of money. I mean, I bought my first Lubena Himid on the hire purchase. I said, I can afford so much a month out of my salary. And I put her work in the art gallery because I wanted young women and young women of color to go into that gallery and say, oh, look, there's somebody like me. Oh, and this is the painter too, who's this brilliant, brilliant painter. I could do that. So there's a kind of really important circuit going on here that we haven't fully cracked, because people don't fully appreciate the interlacing of the, what I call financial value, symbolic value, and public cultural understanding of why it's important for the diversity of the world to be seen in our art world, and to be, for people to invest in writing the books that support the exhibitions and stuff. So for this exhibition, Artemisia, I don't think any of us who are feminists were called upon to participate in any way, even though we laid the ground, we've pushed the issues. And certainly my interpretation of this idea that Judith and Holofernes is not a revenge story, it's a political allegory, that can just be disregarded, just never get there. So I think you're asking a very, very important question.
Oh, well, a slightly depressing note to end on. And, you know,
I don't want it to be depressing. The point is, you mustn't fall prey to the 20th century myth that everything gets better. We have sat on a knife edge in the last 4 or 5 days about the American election, realizing how close we've come to a total disaster in terms of one of the world's democracies, apparently, right? And it is vigilance in the defense of democracy and having faith. So don't be afraid. You just have to keep faith. You have to keep going and understand the network. Enrich yourself with all the great women writers and thinkers and philosophers and theorists and, you know, novelists and artists. And we will keep, you ask the question, you do what you did, say, what about? Why haven't we got those people in my lecture theatres? You exactly do that. And we will keep getting there. And you yourself will find a kind of an invisible embrace of a whole world of women to support you. And we just have to keep pushing, because this is has been the greatest social movement in the 20th century. It has not absolutely succeeded, but it's had huge impact, and we can still have more if we understand what is at stake.
Well, I shall certainly drink to that, and I'm sure all the other participants this evening would like to join me to thank you so much for such an absolutely riveting discussion, and just to hear your views on these questions. So thank you so much. Thank you also to Five Leaves. Absolutely. And buy the book.
Thank you very much indeed. I think somebody asked if it had changed. It's got 2 new prefaces, one for the 2013 and one for this one. That's the only update, because it really is a reprint. But because it's a book that these 2 strange women who came together wrote, I'm inordinately proud to encourage you to read it, not because it's written by me, but because Rosie's sterling brilliance made it an absolutely readable book compared to my somewhat turgid things which lack her refinement when I now write on my own.
Thank you.